First, I want to talk to you a little bit about why our pizza is different than most others. Now, I could spend hours talking about the history of pizza and how it evolved and all the different styles. I struggled with how to be informative, but how to condense this into just a few minutes. Our recipe webpage now has over 1 million hits, so we actually do have pizza fans who come in from all over and who know a lot of this stuff and actually want to talk about it. Many of them have even traveled and they try to hit up the famous spots along the way and compare them and blog about them. So some knowledge for you in this area is a good thing. Let's first start off by talking about the various styles of pizza. Now, it's a tricky subject in a way because, of course, I have to generalize when talking about styles. For example, I can talk about Neapolitan pizza, but, there's 1,500 pizzerias in Naples, and they're all a little bit different. But within each style, there are a few characteristics that do come to define them. This chart shows about a dozen styles of pizza. There's not going to be a quiz on this part. I just want to show you some photos and give you an historical overview. Then in a minute, I'm going to walk you through the 4 most common styles, which I'm showing here in green. And I'm going to go into a bit more detail so I can show you where exactly we fit in. But first, let's just take a second and walk through this list. Now, even in ancient times, people baked flatbreads with stuff on it. The Romans and the Greeks baked breads covered in oil or honey and nuts. But pizza as we know it was invented in Napoli, Italy. We call it Naples. The Americanization of the name is Naples, but it's called Napoli in Italy. The first pizza was actually made on a push cart in around 1738, and eventually that push cart evolved into Pizzeria Port Alba almost 100 years later in around 1830. The first pies were not tomato cheese pies. They were more like some of our specialty pies with cured meats, basil, oregano, and other herbs, sheep or buffalo cheeses, lard, seafood. Pizzeria Brandy is the pizzeria that's actually credited with inventing the tomato, cheese, and basil pizza. It was actually invented not for its taste, but for its colors. In 1889, Queen Margherita was visiting Naples, and they made a pizza for her in the colors of the Italian flag, which was red, white, and green. And voila, we got a pizza to match. That's why we call it a Margherita pizza today. Some menus even call it Margherita Regina, which means Queen Margherita. America's first pizzeria was Lombardi's in Little Italy in Lower Manhattan. Several people who worked directly for Lombardi went and opened their own places. These include Patsy's, John's, and Totonno's. I'm referring to this group as the New York elite. These places were pretty similar to the Neapolitan style. Then, as pizza expanded, we got a style called New York street pizza. I'm going to show the evolution in a minute. There are maybe 8 New York elite pizzerias left, but there are about 2,000 New York street places. Trenton developed a style as early as 1910 called a tomato pie. And I think the original place for that was a place called Joe's, but Di Lorenzo's is now the place that really carries the banner for that style. Next, we have New Haven, Connecticut style. Along with the New York elite, New Haven pizzerias are considered the best in the United States. They spell their pizza with an A in front, which they pronounce Abitz. Pepe's opened up in 1925, and the 2 main spin-offs, Sally's and Modern, in the 1930s. Despite the sign that says Neapolitan Pizzeria, they are really a totally separate New Haven style. Pepe's and Sally's bake in these huge coal ovens, but Modern actually bakes in an oil-fired oven, the only one I've ever seen like that. The style is dark and crunchy. You can see that they use a dry cheese. The pies can actually get a bit greasy, but they are extremely, extremely flavorful. We actually get a lot of Connecticut people come into the restaurant looking for great pizza. New Haven and New England have another style called Greek pizza. I think this evolved more from immigrant Greek diner owners and not really influenced much from what happened in Greece. These are usually baked in a pan with oil. The crust is kind of somewhere between a pizza dough and a pie crust. Let me explain the difference. Breads made with wheat can have bubbles in them. Breads made without wheat, like cornbreads or breads made with rice flour, they don't really have bubbles. That's because only wheat has the key ingredient called gluten. Gluten is a protein, a chemical chain that can make nice bubbles. Gluten needs to be combined with a lot of water to start a bubble, and then it also needs a source of gas to fill the bubbles. So bread starts with wheat that has a lot of gluten. We add lots of water, and then yeast to make air for the bubbles. Pie crust, on the other hand, starts with a medium gluten flour. Then there's just a tiny bit of water, and instead there's a lot of oil. Oils such as butter, lard, or shortening prevent the gluten from forming many bubbles, and pie crusts don't have any gas to fill the bubbles either. Pie crusts, then, are really flaky, not airy. Greek pizza and Chicago pizza both use a crust that's halfway between a bread dough and a pie crust. Chicago's Pizzeria Uno developed the deep dish pie in 1943. It's more of a casserole, really. Chicagoans argue about the difference between deep dish and stuffed crust pizza. Stuffed crust has dough on the bottom and another layer in the middle, whereas deep dish is more like a regular pizza, just with one layer of crust at the bottom. Chicago dough has lard or other fats, so again, it's kind of more like a pie crust almost. St. Louis pizza is very, very thin. I think the crust has no yeast in it at all, which makes it come out very crispy, not quite like a matzah, which is another dough that's made without any yeast, but something more similar to that, more like a cracker. It's cut into squares. It uses a processed cheese, which if you remember is what they call a cheese that's gone through some industrial or chemical processes to melt and blend various products together. So a processed cheese, in this case, this processed cheese is called Provel, and it's a blend of provolone, Swiss, and cheddar. And when they grind it up, they try to combine it back into one cheese. They have to melt it, and that requires various chemical processes to get that to go right. Next up, we have Old Forge, Pennsylvania. This place bills itself as the pizza capital of the world. Go figure. But I've actually had a few people swear by it. Next up, we have American style. American style is what's been developed by the big chains, such as Pizza Hut, Domino's, and later Papa John's. Pizza Hut, I think, started in '58, Domino's a couple of years later in 1960, and Papa John's in the early '80s. We're going to discuss this style a little bit more when we get to the next slide. California pizza was developed in the early '80s mostly by a guy named Ed Ledoux, who worked at Wolfgang Puck's Spago restaurant for a time and later developed the original menu for California Pizza Kitchen. This style is typified by really unusual toppings such as barbecued chicken and goat cheese and salmon and dill, a lot of toppings which you don't typically expect to find on a more traditional Italian pizza. Sicilian pizza is a thicker pie, but not at all like a Chicago style, because the Sicilian uses a light, fluffy crust, which is nothing like the lard-based pie crust used in most Chicago pizzas. Also, Sicilian doesn't have the kind of casserole-like toppings you see in Chicago. It's really just a regular cheese pizza, except it's a thicker crust, which is baked in an oil-lined pan, so it's almost fried. I've not been able to find out much about the history of Sicilian style, except that everyone I know from Sicily says it doesn't come from there. Most New York street pizzerias make a Sicilian pizza. Lately I've seen the term grandma pie used to describe this style, especially if it uses fresher cheese. I've never heard that term growing up, but indeed, my grandma did make this all the time, and in fact, this is how I learned to make my first pies. So that's a pretty good overview of the American styles. Let's now dig deeper into the four major styles in green.